In 1854 South Carolina, my swollen belly was a death warrant. I was a wealthy white widow, and the father was my slave. We thought we could outrun the law, but the overseer was waiting for us with dogs and guns in the pouring rain. Trapped against a raging river, my lover looked at me with a terrifying calm. He knew there was only one way to keep me from being lynched. He didn't kiss me goodbye. He did something so violent and shocking that it fooled everyone and destroyed my soul forever. The noon heat of South Carolina descended upon the plantation like a heavy, wet wool blanket, suffocating sound and thought alike, pressing the very air out of my lungs until breathing became a conscious labor. I sat perfectly still on the veranda, sheltered within the deep shade of massive Doric columns choked by ancient, climbing wisteria, my hand moving in a rhythmic, lethargic motion as I fanned myself with a slip of carved ivory. Before me, the world was a painting of deceptive perfection. Immaculate green lawns that rolled out like carpets, surrendering eventually to the endless, trembling rows of cotton that blurred in the haze of the horizon. I wore black, of course, acres of morning silk and crepe that, despite the fineness of the weave, felt less like a garment and more like a suit of iron armor designed to restrict every breath and gesture. It had been exactly 1 year since my husband was laid to rest in the family plot, and the county society expected a tableau of pious grief and gentle resignation from his young widow. But beneath the bone stays of my corset and the layers of petticoats, I felt no holy sorrow, only a hollow, terrifying emptiness that seemed to grow wider with every beat of the cicadas in the live oaks. A young house girl materialized from the shadows of the doorway, moving with the practiced invisibility of her station, bearing a tray of iced tea. She set it down on the wicker table with exaggerated care, terrified to let the crystal clink against the silver, knowing well that in these long, stagnant months, I had developed a brittle intolerance for noise. I murmured a dismissal without looking at her, my gaze fixed on the blinding whiteness of the garden wall. Everything around me breathed with an oppressive order and a stifling piety, the neatly trimmed boxwood hedges, the whitewashed siding of the mansion that gleamed painful and bright in the sun, and the distant, rhythmic rise and fall of work songs drifting up from the fields like the heartbeat of a beast I owned but did not understand. It was a paradise built on sweat and silence, a gilded cage where I was the queen and the prisoner, trapped in a role that fit me as poorly as a child's shoe on a woman's foot. The silence on the porch suddenly became unbearable, a physical weight that threatened to crush me if I did not move, if I did not find some small distraction to prove I was still alive. I rose abruptly, the movement startling a blue jay from the railing, and decided I would inspect the new mare my overseer had purchased at the auction in Charleston last week. It was a trivial errand, a manufactured purpose, but it offered an excuse to leave the suffocating shade of the veranda. I descended the wide stairs and took the gravel path that wound toward the stables, ignoring the way the heat immediately clamped onto my skin and the fine, gray dust that rose in small clouds to coat the hem of my expensive morning gown. The air grew heavier here, thick with the smells of horsehair, cured leather and sweet feed, a pungent earthy musk that felt more honest than the potpourri of the parlor. I walked with my head held high, a figure of solitary authority in a landscape of labor, but my pulse was quickening with an agitation I could not name, a restless energy that drove me forward toward the dark, cool maw of the barn entrance where the shadows promised a temporary reprieve from the relentless sun. At the entrance to the stables the light shifted, my eyes adjusting slowly to the gloom, and that was when I saw him. Joseph was standing in the center of the breezeway, attending to a lathered stallion. He had stripped off his shirt to work in the stifling heat, a violation of propriety that should have made me turn on my heel instantly, yet my feet seemed to have taken root in the packed earth. His back was to me, a landscape of dark, glistening skin that shone with sweat and water, the muscles shifting and coiling beneath the surface like living things as he lifted a bucket to sluice water over the horse's heaving flanks. I stood frozen, suspended in a moment of transgression, watching the rivulets of water trace the line of his spine. I knew the social codes of 1854 as well as I knew my own name. I should have averted my gaze, I should have barked a sharp reprimand, but the words died in my throat. I was mesmerized by the raw, unadorned vitality of him, so different from the pale, soft-handed men of my own circle who spoke of strength but possessed none of this elemental power. He must have felt the weight of my stare, for he stopped his work mid-motion and turned around with a sharpness that startled the horse. In his hand, He gripped a heavy metal scraper, and his chest rose and fell with the exertion of his labor. For a fraction of a second, the air between us crackled with something dangerous. He did not immediately lower his eyes as he had been trained to do since birth. Instead, he looked at me. In that brief, terrifying window of time, I saw no fear in his dark eyes, nor the dull submission I was accustomed to. I saw a direct, masculine recognition that stripped away my widow's weeds and saw the woman beneath. He stepped forward, perhaps realizing the impropriety of the silence, reaching out to clear a discarded, muddy bridle from my path. As he did, his hand brushed against mine. It was an accident, a grazing of skin against kid leather, but the sensation pierced me with the violence of a branding iron. I recoiled as if I had been struck, my breath catching in a sharp gasp that sounded too loud in the quiet barn. I pulled my hand back, clutching it against my chest, staring at the dark smudge the contact had left on my pristine white glove. Joseph froze, his posture finally dipping into a semblance of apology, but the damage had already been done. In that fleeting second of contact, the rigid, perfectly constructed porcelain world I inhabited had developed a hairline fracture. I turned and walked back toward the house with a speed that bordered on flight, my heart hammering against my ribs not with indignation, but with a terrifying sticky heat. It was not the man I feared, I realized with a jolt that nearly brought me to my knees in the dust. It was the sudden, undeniable understanding that the emptiness inside me had finally found a name, and it was a hunger that could destroy everything I owned. The nights on the plantation were never truly silent. They were a living, breathing entity, a symphonic cacophony of the untamed world pressing against the thin glass of civilization. The air was thick with the relentless, sawing drone of a million cicadas hidden in the live oaks, a sound that rose and fell like a fever tide, accompanied by the mournful staccato cry of the whippoorwills calling from the edge of the swamp. I lay in the center of my massive four-poster bed, entombed beneath the cascading layers of mosquito netting that hung like a bridal veil turned shroud, staring up into the suffocating darkness of the canopy. The linen sheets, usually cool and crisp, felt abrasive against my skin, damp with the humidity that the open windows could not dispel. Sleep was a country I could not reach. Every time I closed my eyes, the darkness behind my lids was illuminated by the memory of the afternoon, the flash of sunlight on wet, dark skin, the ripple of muscle, and that singular electric moment of contact in the barn. The ghost of his touch on my gloved hand burned with a phantom heat that made the blood drum in my ears, louder than the insects outside, a rhythmic pounding that mocked my widow's vow of chastity and silence. I turned over for the 100th time, the feathers of the mattress rustling in protest, but the agitation in my limbs would not settle. The house was asleep, settled into its timber and stone, breathing with the slow, creaking sighs of a structure that had stood for 80 years. But I was vibrantly, painfully awake. The propriety of my bedroom, with its French wallpaper and imported furniture, felt suddenly like a prison cell designed to keep me from the reality of the world outside. I could not stay here, lying in the dark, wrestling with a conscience that was rapidly losing the battle against a darker, more ancient instinct. I threw back the sheets, the movement sharp and decisive, and swung my feet onto the floorboards. The wood was cool, a fleeting relief. I moved to the wardrobe, bypassing the heavy morning silks, and pulled a simple dark shawl over my night rail, wrapping it tight around my shoulders as if to physically contain the trembling that had taken hold of my body. I told myself in the lying whisper of the addict that I only needed fresh air, that the humidity of the room was making me faint, and that a walk in the garden would restore my senses. I moved through the house like a specter, my bare feet making no sound on the Persian runners of the hallway, guided by the moonlight that spilled in pools through the high windows. The portraits of my husband's ancestors watched me from the walls, their painted eyes judging the woman who crept past them in the dead of night, but I did not look back. I slipped out through the side door of the veranda, the hinges well-oiled and silent, and stepped into the heavy embrace of the night. The air was a physical weight, scented with the intoxicating perfume of night-blooming jasmine and the rot of the river mud, a smell that was simultaneously sweet and foul. The garden was a landscape of silver and black, the shadows of the magnolia trees stretching across the lawn like grasping fingers. I did not stop at the rose bushes, nor did I linger by the fountain. My feet, betraying the lie I had told myself, did not wander aimlessly. They found the beaten earth path that led away from the manicured grounds, away from the big house, toward the working heart of the plantation where the polite society of the day did not tread. The old tobacco drying barn stood on the periphery of the estate, a relic from the time before cotton became our king, its weathered gray cypress boards bleached by decades of sun and rain. It loomed against the starry sky like a forgotten cathedral, isolated and silent, separated from the slave quarters by a stretch of fallow field. I walked toward it with a heart that hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, every step a transgression, every breath a violation of the code that kept my world from collapsing. I knew he would be there. There had been no note passed, no word spoken, yet the pull was undeniable, a magnetic tether that connected us across the social abyss. The fear that should have turned me back, the fear of the overseer's patrol, the fear of scandal, the fear of violence, was consumed by a terrifying, reckless need. I reached the rough-hewn door, which hung slightly ajar, and pushed it open. The hinges groaned, a low, mournful sound that was swallowed by the chorus of the night, and I stepped across the threshold into the absolute blackness of the interior. The air inside was different, hotter and drier than the night outside, heavy with the pungent, earthy aroma of cured tobacco leaves and old dust, a scent that was masculine and raw. For a moment I was blind, my eyes useless in the gloom, but I felt him before I saw him. He was a presence in the dark, a displacement of the air, a heat source that radiated in the emptiness. He did not speak, and he did not move to light a lantern. Most tellingly, he did not bow or scramble to acknowledge the mistress of the estate. In the sanctuary of this darkness, the rigid hierarchy that governed our lives under the sun dissolved into nothingness. Here there were no masters and no slaves, only a man and a woman in the dark. I stood by the door, my hand clutching the shawl at my throat, waiting for him to send me away, to save me from myself, but he did not. He waited, his silence a question and an invitation, stripping away the artificial authority I wore like armor during the day. Slowly my eyes adjusted to the slivers of moonlight piercing through the gaps in the siding, painting stripes of silver across the dirt floor. He emerged from the shadows at the far end of the barn, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that belied his size. He stopped a few feet from me, close enough that I could smell the rain and the soap on his skin, close enough to hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. He gave me every opportunity to turn and run, to retreat back to the safety of my canopy bed and my widow's weeds, but my feet remained rooted to the earth. The distance between us was charged, electric with the unspoken acknowledgement of what we were about to do. I let the shawl slip from my shoulders, the fabric pooling on the ground, a silent surrender of my station. He reached out then, his movement tentative yet inevitable, and his hand found the side of my face. His palm was rough, calloused from years of brutal labor in the fields, the skin hard and unyielding, yet he touched me with a reverence that bordered on worship, as if I were made of spun glass that might shatter under the weight of his desire. The contact broke me. I let out a jagged breath, leaning into his touch, closing my eyes against the overwhelming sensation of being truly touched for the first time in years. My late husband had been a man of duty and cold routine, his affection measured out in teaspoons, his touch dry and claiming. This was different. This was fire. The contrast between the roughness of his hand and the softness of my cheek, the visual shock of his dark skin against my pale complexion in the filtered moonlight, was a transgression that thrilled me to my very core. It was forbidden in every sense of the word, a crime written in the law books of the state and the Bible on my nightstand, and that prohibition acted like a drug. I reached up, my fingers trembling, and caught his wrist, not to push him away, but to anchor him to me. The gap between us closed, erased by a hunger that had been starving in silence for too long. When he kissed me, it wasn't a request, it was an annihilation of the world I knew. We sank down onto the scattered hay and old canvas tarps, the dusty floor becoming a bed more precious than the imported mahogany I had left behind. The act that followed was not merely an exchange of passion, it was an act of desperate, violent rebellion. Every touch was a rejection of the society that said he was property and I was a monument to grief. He took me with a fierce, possessive intensity that frightened and exhilarated me, his strength overwhelming my defenses, forcing me to feel the weight of my own existence. I dug my nails into the muscles of his shoulders, biting my lip to stifle the cries that rose in my throat, sounds that would have alerted the world to our treason. In the stifling heat of the barn, with the dust motes dancing in the shafts of moonlight, I was not a widow and I was not a lady. I was a creature of flesh and blood, unmade and remade by the hands of a man who could be killed for looking at me. As the storm of sensation began to recede, leaving us tangled and breathless in the dark, the reality of what we had done settled over me not with regret, but with a terrifying clarity. I lay with my head on his chest, listening to the powerful steady thud of his heart, a sound that felt louder than the thunder of any cannon. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I had given him more than just the use of my body. I had given him power over my life. If we were discovered, I would be ruined, cast out, perhaps even destroyed, and he would face a death of unimaginable agony. Yet, as his arm tightened around me in the gloom, pulling me closer into the protective curve of his body, I realized I did not care about the ruin. I felt a fierce protective possession take root in my chest. I had gambled my safety, my reputation, and my soul for this primitive, honest connection in the dark, and as I looked up at the rafters of the barn, I knew that I would do it again, night after night, until the world burned down around us. 3 months had dissolved into the humid haze of the Lowcountry, dragging the calendar from the crushing heat of July into an October that offered no mercy. The autumn had arrived not with a crisp cooling of the air, but merely as a shift in the palette of the swamp, painting the cypress trees and the marsh grass in bruised shades of russet, burnt orange and dying gold. The heat remained absolute, a stubborn, suffocating presence that clung to the estate like a fever that refused to break, turning the air into a heavy, wet substance that was difficult to inhale. I stood before the tall, gilt-framed mirror in my dressing room, clutching the bedpost with white-knuckled hands, while my personal maid, a young girl named Clara, worked the laces of my corset. Every morning had become a battle of wills between the whalebone stays and my changing anatomy, a silent war waged in the privacy of my boudoir. "Pull harder," I commanded, my voice tight and strained, staring at my reflection with a mixture of vanity and rising panic. Clara hesitated, murmuring an apology, before bracing her knee against the tufted stool and giving the laces a sharp, violent tug. The air left my lungs in a rush, but the relief I sought did not come. The pressure against my ribs was agonizing, but it was the pressure lower down, the subtle, terrifying expansion of my waist, that made the room spin. I knew. The knowledge had settled in my gut weeks ago, heavy and cold as a river stone, long before the physical signs became undeniable. It was a secret written in the cessation of my monthly courses, in the tender swelling of my breasts that made even the brush of silk painful, and in the treacherous nausea that assaulted me with the rising sun. I watched my reflection as Clara tied off the knot, smoothing the chemise over a silhouette that was still, to the untrained eye, the envy of the county. But I saw the truth. My body was betraying me. It was no longer my fortress. It had become a vessel for a scandal so profound it would burn this plantation to the ground. I was carrying a child. Not the heir of a wealthy white planter, which would have been celebrated with balls and toasts, but the bastard child of a man who, by the laws of South Carolina, was listed in the ledger of my estate alongside the livestock and the farm equipment. The life growing inside me was a crime, a biological evidence of treason against my race and my station, a secret that could not be kept forever. I dismissed Clara with a wave of my hand, claiming a headache, and sank onto the chaise lounge, pressing a cool cloth to my forehead. I had become an expert liar in these last weeks, weaving a tapestry of deceit to cover the symptoms of my condition. I blamed the morning sickness on bilious fevers and nervous vapors, maladies that were fashionable enough for a grieving widow to suffer without raising eyebrows. But there was one pair of eyes I could not deceive with feigned migraines. Mom Hattie, the ancient nurse who had birthed half the parish and laid out the dead for 3 generations, watched me with a gaze that stripped away my defenses. She moved through the house like a shadow, silent and observant, her eyes clouded with cataracts yet terrifyingly sharp. Yesterday, when I had turned pale at the smell of curing ham, I caught her staring at me from the pantry door. She didn't say a word, but the look on her weathered face was not one of concern. It was a look of calculation. She knew the rhythms of a woman's body better than any doctor in Charleston, and her silence was more ominous than any accusation. I felt the walls of the big house closing in on me, transforming from a sanctuary into a panopticon where every wretch and every loosened stay was catalogued. By mid-afternoon, the need to see him, to share the crushing weight of this reality, became a physical ache that overpowered my caution. I orchestrated my exit with the precision of a general maneuvering troops, announcing loudly to the household staff that I intended to inspect the lower sluice gates near the river, a task usually reserved for the overseer but one I claimed required my immediate attention due to the dry spell. I donned a wide-brimmed straw hat and walked out into the glare of the sun, clutching a parasol that offered little protection against the humidity. The walk to the river was a journey through a landscape that felt increasingly hostile. The cotton fields, now stripped white and barren after the harvest, looked like a graveyard of skeletal stalks. The air buzzed with the frantic energy of insects sensing the coming winter, and the ground beneath my boots felt spongy and treacherous. Every step took me further from the civilized veneer of the mansion and deeper into the wild, untamed edges of the property where the rules of man held less sway than the laws of nature. Joseph was waiting near the second irrigation ditch, exactly where he knew I would find him. He was repairing a breach in the mud bank, standing knee-deep in the dark, churning water, his movements slow and methodical. As I approached, stepping carefully through the tall sawgrass, he stopped and looked up. The change in him over the last 3 months mirrored my own deterioration. His face was gaunt, the high cheekbones sharper than before, and there were dark hollows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. The strain of our double life, the stolen hours, the constant vigilance, the terror of discovery, was carving him down. He wiped his muddy hands on his trousers and waded toward the bank, his eyes scanning the tree line for the overseer's horse before settling on me. He didn't smile. There was no joy in our reunion today, only a heavy, palpable tension that hung between us like the humid air. He saw the stiffness in my posture, the pale cast of my skin, and the fear vibrating in my hands. He knew. Before I even opened my mouth, he knew that the game had changed. I stopped at the edge of the embankment, the river flowing sluggishly behind him, brown and thick with silt. The silence stretched, filled only by the cawing of a crow in the distance. I tried to speak, but my throat was constricted by a knot of tears I refused to shed. I took a breath, inhaling the smell of river mud and decay, and whispered the words that would seal our fate. "It is not the vapors, Joseph," I said, my voice trembling so violently it was barely audible over the rush of the water. "I am with child." The confession hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. I waited for him to recoil, to panic, to look at me with the resentment of a man who realizes his lover has just handed him a death warrant. I expected him to think of the whip, of the noose, of the dogs. But he did none of those things. Instead, Joseph moved with a fluidity that broke my heart. He did not look around to see if we were watched. He seemingly forgot the world existed. He stepped up onto the muddy bank, heedless of the filth, and sank to his knees before me. It was not the genuflection of a slave to a mistress. It was an act of profound, desperate reverence. He ignored the mud soaking into his trousers, ignored the danger of being seen in such a compromising position by the patrol. He reached out with trembling hands and pressed his palms against the stiff fabric of my skirt, right over the curve of my stomach. He pressed his forehead against me, burying his face in the folds of my dress. I could feel the heat of him through the layers of petticoats, a searing warmth that branded me. He let out a sound, a low, ragged exhale that was half sob, half prayer. In that moment, kneeling in the dirt of the riverbank, he claimed the child. He claimed me. It was a gesture of such suicidal tenderness that I had to bite my lip to keep from screaming. I looked down at the top of his head, at the tight curls damp with sweat, and placed my gloved hand on his shoulder. We stayed frozen like that for a long moment, a tableau of forbidden intimacy framed by the indifference of the swamp. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, but the fear I expected to see was eclipsed by a terrifying resolve. There was a hardness in his gaze now, a steel that hadn't been there before. We both understood, without speaking a word, the mathematics of our situation. A mulatto child born to a white widow in South Carolina was an impossibility. It was a monstrosity in the eyes of the law and the church. If the truth came out, I would be destroyed socially, cast out to starve or locked away in an asylum, but Joseph would be tortured and executed. The child, if it survived, would be sold. "We cannot stay here," he whispered, his voice rough and low, his hands tightening on my waist. "They will kill us, Elizabeth. They will not let this live." Hearing him say my name, stripped of titles, stripped of pretense, brought the reality crashing down on me. This was no longer a romance. It was no longer a passionate rebellion against a cold society. It was a survival situation. The child growing inside me was a bomb ticking beneath the foundation of the plantation, and the fuse was already burning short. I looked at the man I loved, kneeling in the mud, and realized that our love story had ended the moment I conceived. Now we were just two conspirators standing on the edge of a grave, holding hands as the ground began to crumble beneath our feet. The idyllic nights in the barn were over. The nightmare had begun. The atmosphere within the walls of the plantation house, once a sanctuary of bored silence and cool shadows, had curdled into something toxic and suffocating. It was no longer the heat or the humidity that made the air difficult to breathe. It was the omnipresent weight of a gaze that felt as though it were physically stripping the skin from my bones. Silas, the overseer, a man I had previously regarded as little more than a necessary piece of farm equipment, had transformed into a looming predator. He was a creature of swamp water and stale tobacco, with eyes the color of a winter sky, pale, watery, and utterly devoid of warmth. In the past weeks, those eyes had ceased scanning the horizon for slackers in the cotton rows and had instead turned their cold, calculating focus toward the big house. He was everywhere. I would turn from my embroidery frame in the parlor to find him standing just beyond the French doors, staring in with a slouched, insolent posture. I would walk the perimeter of the rose garden only to hear the crunch of his heavy boots on the gravel path behind me, shadowing my movements with a persistence that bordered on hunting. He never spoke directly to me of his suspicions, but the air around him vibrated with a malicious, knowing energy. He smelled of sweat and unwashed wool, a scent that began to permeate my nightmares, and the wet, slapping sound of him chewing his tobacco became the soundtrack to my unraveling sanity. His cruelty, once indiscriminate and spread evenly among the field hands to maintain fear, suddenly found a singular, terrifying focus. He began to use Joseph as an instrument of torture, not to punish the man, but to test the woman. It was a psychological vivisection performed in broad daylight. Silas would manufacture reasons to discipline Joseph: a furrow plowed crookedly, a harness allegedly oiled improperly, a look that was deemed uppity. He would drag Joseph into the main courtyard, directly within my line of sight from the veranda, and enact his petty tyrannies with a theatrical slowness. I was forced to stand there, gripping the railing until the splinters dug into my palms, my face frozen in a mask of aristocratic indifference, while the man I loved was humiliated for my benefit. Silas would strike him, not with the full lash but with the handle of the whip or a heavy shove into the dirt, and then immediately, his head would snap toward the porch. He was not looking at Joseph, he was looking at me. He was waiting for a flinch, a gasp, a tear. Any microscopic crack in the porcelain facade of the grieving widow. It was a game of cat and mouse played with human flesh, and every blow that landed on Joseph's body reverberated through my own nervous system with the force of a physical impact. The agony of those afternoons was absolute. To intervene would be to sign Joseph's death warrant. To remain silent felt like losing my soul. I remember one Tuesday with a clarity that still makes my hands shake. The heat was blistering, the sun bleaching the color from the world, and Silas had Joseph on his knees in the dust, berating him for a missing tool that I knew Silas himself had hidden. I watched from behind the veil of wisteria, my corset feeling like a cage of iron bars crushing my ribs. Silas raised his hand, and Joseph did not flinch, his eyes fixed on the ground, his dignity a silent roar in the quiet yard. When the blow came, a backhanded strike across the face that split Joseph's lip, I felt the phantom pain explode in my own mouth. The metallic taste of blood flooded my tongue. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run down the stairs and claw Silas's eyes out. But I stood frozen, rigid as a statue, sipping my iced tea with a hand that I forced to remain steady through sheer, agonizing will. Silas looked up at me then, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust near Joseph's head, and smiled. It was a small, tight curving of thin lips that said, as clearly as any words, "I know you feel this." The final shattering of my fragile pretense occurred on a humid evening 3 days later. Dinner was a solitary affair, usually eaten in silence at the long mahogany table that could seat 20. The candles flickered in the draught, casting long, dancing shadows against the velvet wallpaper. I was picking at a plate of roast pheasant, my appetite long gone, when the heavy oak doors opened without a knock. Silas entered. He had never dared to enter the dining room while I was eating. It was a breach of protocol so severe it would have been grounds for dismissal in my husband's time. But the old laws no longer applied. He walked to the table, his muddy boots leaving clumps of red clay on the expensive Persian rug, the sound of his intrusion echoing like gunshots in the quiet room. He did not remove his hat. He stood at the opposite end of the table, looming over the empty chair where my husband used to sit, and stared at me with those dead, watery eyes. The air in the room grew heavy and cold, the smell of the roast bird suddenly turning my stomach. He reached into the pocket of his stained coat and withdrew an object, holding it delicately between his thick, calloused fingers as if it were a rare jewel. It was a square of lace, delicate, expensive, and unmistakably mine. It was a handkerchief I had lost weeks ago, embroidered with my initials in silk thread. I stared at it, the blood draining from my face so fast I felt dizzy. He didn't have to tell me where he had found it. He walked slowly down the length of the table, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and placed the handkerchief on the white tablecloth next to my wine glass. It was stained with grease and bits of straw, stable straw. "Found this in the old curing barn, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that dripped with mock servility. "Way in the back. In the hay. Must have been the wind that carried it all the way out there. Strange place for a lady's fine lace to end up." He smiled then, a grotesque expression that revealed yellowed teeth stained with tobacco. He didn't say, "I know you are sleeping with him." He didn't say, "I own you now." He didn't have to. The handkerchief was the gavel coming down. I stared at the stained lace, the monogram mocking me, and felt the trap snap shut around my throat. Silas lingered for a moment longer, enjoying the terror radiating from me, savoring the total shift in power. He was no longer the servant. He was the master of the secret. Then, with a tip of his hat that was more insult than courtesy, he turned and walked out, leaving the door wide open behind him. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. I sat there for an hour, unable to move, while the candles burned down to nubs. The game was over. He wasn't going to report me immediately. He was going to bleed me. He would blackmail me, perhaps demand money, perhaps demand things far worse, and eventually, when he grew bored, he would destroy us anyway. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. There was no future in this house. The timeline I had constructed in my head, the hope of hiding the pregnancy a little longer, of finding a solution, had evaporated. Time had run out. Panic, cold and sharp, gave way to a frantic, crystalline clarity. I rose from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and ran to the library. My husband's study had remained untouched since his funeral, a mausoleum of leather books and the smell of stale cigar smoke. I locked the door behind me and went straight to the large iron safe, hidden behind the portrait of his grandfather. My hands trembled violently as I dialed the combination. Right to 20, left to 10, right to 5. The mechanism clicked, a sound of heavy finality, and the heavy door swung open. Inside lay the lifeblood of the plantation. Stacks of gold coins, bundles of bank notes, and the deeds to the land. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a leather satchel and began to shovel the money inside. Gold, silver, paper, it didn't matter. I was stealing my own inheritance, looting the corpse of my marriage to buy a life that was never meant to exist. I stripped the safe bare of cash, leaving the deeds and the ledgers, the paper trappings of a power I was abandoning. But money was not enough. Money could buy horses in silence, but it could not buy direction. I rummaged frantically through the drawers of the massive oak desk until my fingers closed around a roll of parchment, a surveyor's map of the northern territories my husband had commissioned years ago for an investment scheme that never materialized. I unrolled it on the desk, my eyes tracing the lines of the rivers and the roads that led away from this cursed heat, up through the mountains toward the free states. It was a fool's errand. The distance was immense, the terrain unforgiving, and we would be hunted every step of the way. A white woman traveling with a black man who was not her servant would draw attention in every town, at every crossroads. Yet, as I traced the line of the Ohio River with my fingertip, I felt the kick of the child in my womb, a flutter of life that was stronger than my fear. To stay was death. To run was madness. But in the madness there was a sliver of hope. I moved through the dark house like a thief, shedding my heavy morning gown for the simplest, sturdiest riding dress I owned. I packed only the essentials into the satchel: the money, the map, a pistol I had taken from the study, and a few pieces of jewelry sewn into the lining of my cloak. Every object I touched I was touching for the last time. The silver candlesticks, the silk drapes, the portraits of ancestors, they were all ghosts now. I was severing the tether to my history, burning the bridge before I had even crossed it. The thought of losing my status, of becoming a fugitive, of living in squalor and fear, should have paralyzed me. But the image of Silas's face, of his dirty hand touching my lace, fueled a rage that burned hotter than my terror. I would not let him win. I would not let him touch my child. I slipped out into the night, the heavy bag slung over my shoulder, moving toward the stables where the man I loved was waiting, unaware that tonight we would leave this world behind or die trying. The night of our escape did not fall gently. It collapsed upon the plantation with the violence of a biblical plague, the sky tearing open to unleash a torrent that felt less like rain and more like a physical assault. The wind howled through the canopy of the ancient oaks, snapping branches with the sound of cracking bones, while the thunder rolled in continuous, overlapping waves that shook the very ground beneath my boots. I moved through this chaotic maelstrom like a ghost in a nightmare, clutching the leather satchel to my chest, my simple woolen dress already soaked through and clinging to my skin like a second freezing layer. The mud of the path was treacherous, sucking at my ankles with every step, threatening to drag me down into the earth, but terror proved to be a more potent fuel than adrenaline. I kept my head down, squinting against the stinging lash of the rain, navigating by the flash of lightning that illuminated the world in stark, strobe-like bursts of blue and white. Every shadow looked like a man. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a shout. I was leaving everything I had ever known. My home, my name, my history. Walking away into a void of uncertainty, driven only by the fierce, terrified love for the unborn life I carried and the man waiting for me in the dark. I reached the rendezvous point at the edge of the property, where the old wooden bridge spanned the narrowest part of the creek. The water, usually a lazy, murmuring stream, had swollen into a raging brown torrent that churned and foamed against the pylons, threatening to sweep the entire structure away. Joseph was there, a dark silhouette against the gray curtain of the rain, struggling to hold the bridles of two panicked horses. The animals were rearing and tossing their heads, their eyes rolling white in the darkness, sensing the electricity in the air and the tension radiating from their handler. Seeing him there, drenched and fighting for control, I felt a surge of hope so painful it nearly buckled my knees. He was real. We were doing this. I stumbled toward him, slipping on the slick embankment, and he reached out a wet, strong hand to steady me. There were no words of greeting, no tender embraces. The roar of the storm swallowed all sound. We simply looked at each other, two fugitives on the precipice of the world, united by a desperate, reckless courage. He pulled the horses closer, shouting something I couldn't hear over the thunder, motioning for me to mount quickly. But before my foot could even find the stirrup, the darkness around us was shattered not by lightning, but by the artificial yellow glare of lanterns swinging violently in the gloom. They emerged from the tree line like demons manifesting from the storm itself, dark shapes of men on horseback, their long coats flapping in the wind. The sound that followed froze the blood in my veins, a sound more terrifying than the thunder. The baying of hounds. Silas had not been sleeping. The old fox had been waiting by the den, anticipating the rabbit's run. He had known. He had watched. And now he had sprung the trap. The dogs surged forward, straining against their leashes, a mass of wet fur and bared teeth, their barks mixing with the shouts of the men. "There!" a voice bellowed, cutting through the rain. "By the creek. Cut them off." We were surrounded in seconds, trapped between the raging water and the wall of armed men. The horses we had stolen screamed and bolted, tearing the reins from Joseph's hands and disappearing into the night, taking our only hope of salvation with them. We were alone. The circle of lanterns tightened, the light reflecting off the barrels of shotguns and the cold, wet metal of the overseer's pistol. Silas rode forward, his horse dancing nervously in the mud, looking down at us with a grim satisfaction that turned his watery eyes into chips of ice. He didn't speak immediately. He just let the hopelessness of the moment settle over us like a shroud. I stood paralyzed, clutching Joseph's arm, my mind racing through 1,000 scenarios, each ending in death. I realized with a sickening jolt that they didn't just see a runaway slave. They saw the mistress of the house standing beside him, dressed for travel, holding a bag of money. The truth was naked and undeniable. If they took us now, if they dragged us back to the house and interrogated us, the scandal would be absolute. The pregnancy would be discovered. I would be disgraced, perhaps lynched by a mob furious at the betrayal of my race, and my child, Joseph's child, would be cut from my womb or born only to be killed. There was no trial that would save us. There was no mercy in the eyes of the men surrounding us. Joseph turned to look at me. The rain was streaming down his face, mingling with the sweat and the dirt, but his eyes were clear. In that chaos, in the center of the storm, he found a moment of absolute terrifying stillness. He looked at me not with fear, but with a profound, heartbreaking acceptance. He saw what I was too terrified to acknowledge. He did the calculus of our survival in a single heartbeat and realized that the equation could not balance with both of us alive. If we were lovers, we both died. But if I was a victim, if I was the helpless white woman wronged by a savage, then I might live. The child might live. I saw the decision form in his eyes, a hardening of his soul that shattered me. I shook my head, silently mouthing no, begging him not to do what I knew he was about to do. I gripped his arm tighter, trying to anchor him to me, to the truth of our love, but he was already gone. He was no longer my lover. He was a man preparing to lay down his life on the altar of a lie. He moved with a violence that shocked the breath out of me. He didn't kiss me goodbye. He didn't whisper a final word of love. Instead, he roared, a guttural, animal sound, and shoved me backward with all his strength. His heavy hand struck my shoulders, throwing me off balance, sending me sprawling into the cold, churning mud of the riverbank. The impact knocked the wind out of me and I gasped, sucking in mud and water, stunned by the aggression. Before I could scramble up, he loomed over me, snatching the leather satchel from my grasp. He ripped it away with a force that burned my fingers, holding it up like a trophy in the lantern light. "You think you can stop me?" he screamed, his voice booming over the storm, distorted by a rage that was entirely manufactured. "I took the gold. I took it all. Get back, woman, or I'll break your neck like I broke the lock." He was acting. He was weaving a narrative for the audience of men watching from the darkness, painting himself as the thief, the brute, the monster who had assaulted his mistress when she caught him stealing. I lay in the muck, the rain blinding me, trying to process the horror of his sacrifice. "Joseph, no!" I screamed, but my voice was a weak, broken thing, drowned out by the roar of the thunder and the shouts of the men. He turned away from me, facing Silas and the posse, clutching the bag of money to his chest. He didn't run. He didn't try to dive into the river or flee into the woods. He stood his ground, making himself big, making himself a target. He brandished the bag, challenging them, ensuring that every eye was fixed on him and his crime. He was drawing the lightning, pulling the hatred and the violence of the mob onto himself to shield me from the truth. He looked at Silas, a sneer of defiance on his face, playing the part of the rebellious slave to the bitter end. "Come and get it," he yelled. "It's mine. It's all mine." He was buying my life with his own, second by agonizing second. Silas did not hesitate. He didn't call for the dogs to attack. He didn't order his men to subdue the thief. He simply raised his pistol, leveling it with a calm, professional detachment. There was no trial here, no questions asked. A slave had stolen from the master's safe and assaulted the mistress. The sentence was death, carried out in the rain. I saw the flash of the muzzle before I heard the sound, a sharp, cracking report that seemed to split the night in two. The bullet struck Joseph in the chest, jerking him backward as if he had been pulled by an invisible rope. The bag of money flew from his hand, spilling gold coins into the mud, a glittering shower of useless metal. He didn't cry out. He simply crumpled, his legs folding beneath him, and fell back into the wet earth, his blood instantly mixing with the rain. I screamed then, a raw tearing sound that shredded my throat, scrambling on my hands and knees toward him. But I was stopped. Rough hands grabbed me, pulling me back, lifting me out of the mud. "It's all right, ma'am," a voice said, soothing and sickeningly gentle. "We got him. You're safe now. The brute can't hurt you." I struggled against them, my eyes fixed on the body lying in the rain, on the dark stain spreading across his chest. He wasn't moving. The man who had held me with such infinite tenderness, the father of the child growing inside me, was gone. He had died a thief's death to preserve my honor. He had sealed our secret with his blood, locking his lips forever so that I could live a lie. I hung limp in the arms of the men who had killed him, the rain washing the mud from my face but unable to wash away the horror, staring at the empty shell of my lover and realizing that I was now truly, utterly alone in a world that felt cold as the grave. 2 decades had ground their way across the face of the earth, wearing down the mountains and the memories of men alike, but on the veranda of the plantation house, time seemed to have pooled and stagnated like black water in a cypress swamp. I sat in the same high-backed wicker chair where I had once fanned myself as a young widow, but the woman who occupied the seat now was a stranger to that ghost. 20 years of silence and deception had carved deep, unforgiving lines around my mouth and etched a permanent furrow of anxiety into my brow. I was dressed in the same heavy, suffocating black that had become my second skin, a perpetual mourning not for the husband buried in the family crypt, but for the lover buried in the unconsecrated ground at the edge of the cotton fields. The heat was just as oppressive as it had been on that fateful night, a physical weight that pressed down on the roof of the house, but my blood had grown thin and cold over the years, and I shivered beneath my shawl even as the sun blistered the paint on the railing. I was a relic, a stone monument to a lie that had grown so large it had swallowed the entire world, sitting in the shadow of the wisteria that had thickened into a twisted, choking cage around the porch. Beside me, leaning against the white column with a casual, terrifying arrogance, stood the living embodiment of my sin and my salvation. William was 20 years old, a man fully grown, possessed of a physical beauty that made women in Charleston stop and stare behind their fans. He was tall, with the broad, powerful shoulders of a laborer hidden beneath the cut of a fine linen suit, and his skin was the color of old ivory, not white, but a rich, creamy shade that glowed in the afternoon light. His hair was a cascade of dark, tight curls that he tamed ruthlessly with expensive oils and pomades, forcing them to lie flat against his skull in the fashion of the European aristocracy he believed he descended from. He held a crystal tumbler of bourbon in one hand, swirling the amber liquid with a lazy, hypnotic rhythm, watching the world with eyes that were dark, intelligent, and utterly devoid of mercy. He was my son. He was the child I had carried through the storm and the bloodshed, the life I had purchased with Joseph's death, and looking at him now, I felt a nausea that had nothing to do with the heat. The society of South Carolina, desperate for continuity and blinded by the glare of my family's gold, had swallowed the lie without choking. When I returned from my confinement in the north, holding a swarthy, dark-eyed infant, I had armored myself with the story of a premature birth and the genetic resurgence of my late husband's Italian ancestors. It was a ridiculous, fragile fabrication, a story that should have crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. But wealth is a powerful sealant. It fills the cracks in any narrative. No one dared to question the wealthy widow whose cotton still shipped to Liverpool, and over time, the lie calcified into truth. William grew up believing he was the scion of a noble, exotic bloodline, a prince of the South with a touch of Mediterranean fire. He wore his heritage like a crown, unaware that the features he preened over in the mirror, the fullness of his lips, the texture of his hair, the depth of his eyes, were the legacy of a man who had died in the mud, branded a thief and a brute. The irony was a razor blade lodged in my throat, cutting me every time I heard him speak of breeding and honor. William took a sip of his whiskey, the ice clinking softly, and gestured with his free hand toward the fields below us. Even 20 years later, the dynamics of the land had changed little in spirit, though the laws had shifted on paper. A group of field hands was working in the relentless sun, and in their midst the new overseer, a man as cruel as Silas had ever been, was disciplining a worker for some perceived infraction. It was a brutal scene, the kind that used to make me retreat to my room with smelling salts, but William watched it with a detached, critical interest, like a connoisseur inspecting a painting. "He's too lenient," William drawled, his voice a smooth baritone that vibrated with a chill I knew too well. "You have to break the spirit, mother, not just the skin. If you let them think they have dignity, you lose control." He spoke of the people in the field, people who shared his blood, people who could have been his cousins, as if they were livestock, distinct and separate species from himself. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the ghost of Joseph shimmering beneath the surface of the tyrant. It was in the way William stood, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, ready to spring. It was in the shape of his hands, large and capable, hands that could soothe a horse or break a neck. It was in the curve of his jawline, a carbon copy of the man who had held me in the tobacco barn with such infinite tenderness. But where Joseph had been defined by a quiet, enduring strength and a capacity for sacrificial love, William was defined by a hollow, brittle power. He had inherited his father's strength but none of his soul. I had saved the vessel but corrupted the contents. By raising him in the poison of this house, by feeding him the lie of his superiority, I had twisted Joseph's legacy into a weapon. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had not saved Joseph's child. I had destroyed him. I had erased his identity so completely that he had become the very thing his father hated. A man who held the whip, a man who believed that power came from crushing those beneath him. William turned to me, catching my stare, and raised an eyebrow in a gesture of haughty inquiry. "You look pale, mother," he said, not with concern, but with a slight tone of annoyance, as if my frailty were an inconvenience to his afternoon. "Perhaps you should go inside. The heat does not agree with you." His eyes were dark like Joseph's, but they were hard and flat, reflecting the world back without letting anything in. There was no love there. There was only the calculation of an heir waiting for his inheritance, the impatience of a young wolf waiting for the old she-wolf to die so he could lead the pack. He turned back to the field, seemingly bored by my silence, and took another drink, dismissing me entirely. He was a perfect product of his environment, a masterpiece of my own making, a monster forged from a lie. I had sacrificed my soul and Joseph's life to ensure this boy would live free, but looking at the cruelty curled around his mouth, I wondered if death might have been a cleaner mercy than this slow, rotting corruption. I turned my head away, unable to bear the sight of him any longer, and directed my gaze toward the edge of the property, where the cultivated lawn gave way to the wilder scrub of the tree line. There, marked only by a simple, uncarved river stone that had long since sunk halfway into the earth, was the grave. No name was chiseled there, no date, no scripture. It was a silent scar on the landscape, the only physical proof that Joseph had ever existed. I stared at that stone until my vision blurred, imagining the bones resting beneath the soil. The chest that had once sheltered me now turned to dust. I thought of the night in the rain, the sound of the gunshot, the way Joseph had looked at me with that final, devastating acceptance. He had died so that I could remain a lady. He had died so that his son could live. And his son was living, standing 10 feet away from me, sipping bourbon and advocating for the torture of a man who might have been his brother. A profound, crushing sense of futility settled over me, heavier than the black silk of my dress. The sacrifice had been in vain. The love that had felt so revolutionary, so powerful that it could defy the laws of God and man, had resulted in nothing but ash. I had preserved the body but lost the spirit. I reached out with a trembling hand and lifted the teacup from the table, the china rattling against the saucer in a betraying rhythm. I brought it to my lips, needing to wash away the taste of bile in my throat, but when I drank, the liquid offered no relief. It was cold and stale, and as it slid down my throat, it tasted bitter like charred wood and regret. It tasted like the ashes of the life I could have had, the ashes of the man I murdered with my cowardice, and the ashes of the son I had turned into a stranger. I sat there on the veranda, the mistress of the plantation, the mother of the master, and I knew that I was already dead. I was just waiting for the earth to accept the rest of me.